Hey everyone, David here with your weekly Mouthful of David video. But before we get into today's question, we'll start with the updates like always. So we're trying a new thing with the podcast. As opposed to doing one longer episode that's usually maybe, hour and a half or so, what we're doing is we're recording in the same way, but we're releasing things in parts. And so we're going to try for a while just to have our episodes be in two, maybe 3 part segments. And so with our, I guess you could say, kind of current episode, we have done part 1 already. We've released that, and it is about the lead up to the First Indochina War, which was the War of Independence by the Vietnamese against the French. So we've done part 1 about that, and so it's basically, the build up to the actual war itself. Part 2 should be coming out pretty soon, and that's just about, the battle itself, the war itself. And then part 3 will be about, the resolution and the aftermath, and basically how the U.S. kind of took over the Vietnam War from the French. So be on the lookout for that. Pretty excited because I feel pretty good about how that one came out. Our next episode, or series of episodes, however you want to think about it, that we'll be doing is about Lenin. And then after that is my choice to choose a topic, and so I'm probably going to be doing some boxing history. So looking forward to all the stuff that's on the horizon. But anyway, the question that I want to talk about this week is a big one. I've honestly been putting off talking about this one for a little bit just because it's a really heady one, and I really wanted to give it adequate thought, make sure I can articulate it well. But this is the 20th Mouthful of David episode that I've done, so I feel like I've had enough experience articulating things so that I can kind of tackle this question in the way that it deserves to be tackled. So the question this week is, do the winners write the history, right? And that's something that you've probably heard at some point, in pointing out that a lot of what we get in history is decided by the survivors and the winners of battles, the people who make it through hardship and who are also well off enough to leave detailed records, right? So the answer to that question is yes, but yes, the history records that we have and the subsequent writings of history are usually written by the winners, but we as a field have gotten a lot better at kind of accounting for that, and I'll explain what that means in a second. But first, before I get into how we're kind of, working against the grain and how we understand history to account for that, it is really worth mentioning that pretty much every source that we have from history, especially written records, are generally left by the quote-unquote winners, or, other times not necessarily winners of any particular thing, but just generally the more educated, affluent classes. Because throughout most of human history, it has been the people who are toward the top of the hierarchy who have been literate and who have been able to write and leave behind records. There have been some exceptions. Some places writing and reading was a little bit more widespread, but it's a pretty consistent pattern overall. That it's, again, the more fortunate, more well-off and affluent people who leave those records behind and who are subsequently the people whose perspectives we are exposed to most. And, even going further into that, of course, using the term winner more immediately, if you have a battle between different cultures or different groups or whatever, and one succeeds in, really, I don't want to say wiping out, because wiping out, complete erasure of a people doesn't happen as often in history as we think, but definitely a subjugation, a taking away of, their ability to do things for themselves, is definitely something that has happened and silenced, a lot of voices, both individual and collective, throughout history. So in that sense, yes, it is also literally written by the winners. So that's something that we as historians have gotten a lot better, though, in keeping in mind as we're looking at sources throughout history. And even when we're reading older history accounts themselves, because this is something that hasn't been as consciously, we'll say, checked against up until recently. And I'll explain a little bit more of that in a second. But, a lot of the times people who chronicle events are from that more affluent class. And so even past historians, as much as they're appreciated, aren't necessarily even trying to be objective, right? Or at least for the most part. Some in the past have made good faith efforts, but generally it's a very glorified account of what they are covering. So with all that said, right, we have a certain set of records that definitely give voice to some perspectives more than others. So what we do from there then as historians is we try to read against the grain. We try to ask questions like, whose perspective is this? What do we know about this author? What do we know about who we're not hearing from? And from those questions, we read sources trying to piece together who is being excluded. And one thing that's really helped, actually, well, a number of things have helped, but one thing that has helped is we've gotten better at broadening our scope of what we consider a real history, right? And so, for example, in the last decade or so, we've gotten better at including oral histories as part of the quote-unquote, proper set of historical sources that we can look at and use and analyze and everything. And a lot of cultures, especially pre-industrial cultures, relied a lot on oral histories in order to pass things down. Another thing that we've done is it's a school of historical thought, but it's one of those things where there's the people who are specifically from that school, but there's other people who have just kind of taken the techniques and applied them in their own form of history as well. And that's called the history of subaltern studies, or subaltern history. And so what subaltern history does is basically look at sources that aren't excluded look at who is excluded from the historical sources, and basically try to piece together their perspective from what you do know about the people, about these excluded peoples. And so, an easy example is during colonization in the Americas, the main sources that we have from, say, like Spanish America are from the Spanish and the people of Spanish descent in the colonies. So, you might see a court record about indigenous people who are kind of, brown-nosing the crown and trying to say that they're, simple vassals of the crown, blah, blah, blah. And then if the crown doesn't listen to them, then they revolt. Now, without thinking about that critically, if you just read those sources at face value, you might think, oh, wow, indigenous people are shifty and can't be trusted. And that was a stereotype that people had of the crown. Of indigenous people. But when you kind of try to read against the grain and think about, okay, why might they be doing this? You kind of think, well, okay, if I were being invaded and brutally controlled by these outside forces, these outside occupiers, and I knew that thanks in part to being ravaged by disease, but also with, the military technology and stuff that the Spanish have, I can't just, dig in my feet and fight unless I really, really have to. And it's something where I have no other choice. And so it makes sense from that kind of assumption to then try to butter up the people in charge to see if you can kind of get them on your side. And then if they don't listen to you and they don't respect you, and you are faced with either listening to what they say but starving or being ravaged by disease or something, or on the other hand standing up and fighting, then you're gonna fight for your life. And so those are the sorts of things we try to consider as historians, especially again if we're kind of connected to that methodology of subaltern studies, to try to understand the way people would think and feel in a given situation. But then we also, of course, try to cross-reference those thoughts with what we do know about a culture, because then otherwise we're just kind of taking a shot in the dark guess. So basically, overall, do the winners write history? Yes, but we do everything that we can to make sure that we are thinking about who's being left out, try to include them as much as we possibly can, and also, critically analyzing and asking questions about the sources that we do have to work with. And in piecing that all together, the end result isn't perfect, because nothing's ever going to be perfect, but it is absolutely better than nothing, right? So thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe to our podcast. We're on pretty much every platform. Leaving reviews would be super great. If you've listened to us before, it'd be really helpful. So if you could do that, thank you. Other than that, have a good week, everyone, and catch you next time. Peace.